Clearly, there's still no perfect solution for live action shooting, but you can make it work if you want to go to the extents that Robin has gone to. Another approach to acquiring Fulldome content is to go the pure animation route. And I've listed a number of 3D packages up here. These are the major ones. There are some other ones. 3ds Max and Maya are probably the most common. Blender is available for free, so if you want to dip your toe in without spending any money, you could do that. Lightwave, Cinema 4D is up and coming, and Houdini recently, in the last few years, has been coming down in price, so that's becoming within more people's reach. Here I just list some supplemental software that you'll find in various pipelines. ZBrush and Mudbox for sculpting, Modo for modeling, RealFlow for fluids. Yeah, lots of stuff. But I do want to mention www.fulldome.org. If you're trying to do this stuff and you have questions, this is a good place to go and post your questions and hopefully get an answer. It's a discussion forum specifically for Fulldome producers. Okay, animation software. Okay, I'm sorry. I was a little confused because these slides look a little different than last time I saw them. There are two approaches to using these 3D packages to create dome masters. You can render directly to the dome masters using ray tracing software, or you can render multiple camera views and stitch them together. And there are advantages and disadvantages of each method. So if you're when you're rendering directly to the dome master, first of all, there are a few renderers out there that can do this. Not all of them can. Typically, it has to be a ray tracer to be able to do this. But if you use one of these, you're looking at fewer steps, less handling. There's no stitching process. You can get more accurate data channels, such as Z-depth, normals, et cetera. Some of these don't like the stitching process. They can't be anti-aliased because they're data, and that messes with the data. Generally, you're going to get a higher quality. There's no warping involved here. As I said, it requires ray tracing. Many years ago, that was a big deal because it meant that you needed a lot more computer power if you were going to use a ray tracer, because they used to be slower. Nowadays, we've got enough computer power that using a ray tracer is extremely common. I think most renderers now use ray tracing to some extent. So it's not such a big deal anymore, but that is scene dependent. Some scenes are going to be slower in ray tracers, some are going to be faster. And if you're rendering directly to the fisheye, you can get EXR support. EXR is a file format, which is very commonly used because it can store more color depth and various data channels right inside. The other approach is stitching. The advantage here is that you can use any renderer. It doesn't have to be a ray tracer. It doesn't have to have support for rendering to a fisheye format. It can be faster, and one example of that is if you have a lot of particle systems like facing particles or scenes with many semi-transparent overlapping surfaces, they still tend to give ray tracers a hard time. So they can be faster with the scanline type renderers. It's possible to reveal seams in the stitches, so you have to be wary of that. And the stitchers, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, don't really handle data channels very well, if they handle them at all. So the third way of acquiring data for your dome masters is to use a hybrid. You can use live action capture or still photography and combine that with animation and computer graphics techniques to create things that look like the real world. And I think a lot of what Robin was talking about sort of falls into this category. You're doing a lot of computer processing on the live capture to get it onto the dome. So here we're just kind of expanding that. And what you see here, it looks like just a still image. This is a cutout from, you'll get to see this if you see our work in progress session in the dome. But this was taken here in Colorado. And what you see is a still panorama that was captured, but the water has been replaced with computer graphics water so that we have the ripples animated. It's all been projected onto a digital elevation map. so that we can actually move the camera with limits around in that environment. So we start with a still photo, and then we're able to animate on top of it and move the camera around inside of it. This is what we use to capture panoramas. You don't really need this anymore, but it is nice because it gives you repeatability. If you need to do a lot of panorama capturing, it's good to have a Nodal Ninja or something like it. There are several devices like this. You can do set extension. Here's another example, just really quickly. The foreground with the grasses and the water in this example, that was all live action. Multiple channels stitched together there. The midground with the mountains, that was still panorama. And then the sky was replaced with a time lapse of an aurora, which was actually slowed down, back down to real time. So you can do things like that. Photogrammetry, where you take lots of pictures of an object or an environment and use computer software to create a model from that. You can combine live action with virtual sets. So in this example, we're shooting in a green screen. We're tracking the camera move that was made in the green screen studio, filming this actor, and then placing him in a computer-generated environment, which in this case uses the hybrid techniques. And the most common, you find this all the time going back forever, just texture mapping. You take photos, you project them onto a 3D model. You take a video, in this case, SDO imagery from NASA, project it back onto a sphere, and that lets you move a virtual camera around and get nice parallax and dimension. Compositing is the next step. So you can think of compositing software like Photoshop for moving pictures. And it's generally used to combine live action elements with CG, fix render problems. You can do warpings in there, things like that. And these are the most common compositing packages right now. After Effects, Fusion, which is really interesting because it was acquired by another company, and now you can get it for free. It's a little bit of a cut down version, but not much, still very usable. So definitely take a look at that. Nuke is another one, and Composite, if you use Max or Maya, you have that because it's part of that package. The next step is editing. This is a typical editing process here. I'm going to kind of brush over this because I think we're limited on time. But typically you'll edit with lower resolution proxies and then conform your dome masters to that. And one of the reasons for that is the resolution. Most editors can't really deal very well with 4K or 8K or 8K stereo that we're doing. So you have to use this more technical process. So let's talk about technical hurdles. And I'm going to turn it over to Paul to talk about that.
Thanks, Brian. So yeah, just going to chat about some of the common technical challenges with Fulldome production. So we're basically in a whole world of pain, but there's just an awful lot of data. It's data overload. So when we talk about Fulldome, we often talk a lot about resolution. I mean, just look at that big, horrible, enormous purple circle there. This is kind of the new aspirational kind of resolution that we're starting to talk about and consider producing for now. When we did this just a couple of years ago, we used to say, oh, look at HD and then look at 4K. Isn't it crazy? But now, I don't want to look at that slide any longer. And it's interesting because when you talk to people in the film industry or the broadcast TV industry, they're whining and moaning about the transition from HD to 4K by 2K 16:9 production. And we've been dealing with 4K by 4K for the past 10 years. And now we've got 8K stereoscopic 60 frames a second. But I'm going to talk about resolution and the implications of that. But that's not the only technical hurdle to overcome. So with Fulldome, we're dealing with high frame rate stereoscopic 3D, which cause a lot of issues with high data rates and data management. And so this is kind of just a bit of an example of what might be a common fully kind of CG production. So 23-minute fully computer generated full dome film, 4K by 4K, 30 frames a second. We're assuming we've got a 50 node render farm of a particular specification. One thing to consider as well is, you don't just render this thing once, you go through a lot of iterations. So often you'll work at a lower resolution for a long time, and then you'll do a certain amount of iterations at a higher resolution. So we made a bunch of assumptions, but we kind of come out at about 4 months of solid rendering on that render farm for a typical production. So when we start to introduce high frame rate, stereoscopic 3D, 8K stereoscopic high frame rate, this thing scales quite astronomically. So from that 4 months, we're jumping 12 times. So if we had exactly, this is kind of a bit of a hypothetical thing, so this isn't a real world scenario, but if we literally wanted to create exactly the same 4K 2D 30 frames a second show in 8K 3D 60 frames a second, it's a 12 times jump. So we're talking 4 years as opposed to 4 months of solid rendering. So this is obviously not practical. Compromises have to be made, and something has to give within the production value of the show and the shot choices that you made, or you need to throw a ridiculous amount of money at render resource. And it's not just render time as well, increased staff time to generate those higher resolution assets, so the actual process of rendering it at 8K is worthwhile. So frame rate, high frame rate, it's had a bit of a rocky start in Hollywood, with Hobbit, I think, being the only example. It's had a bit of a mixed response. Interestingly, a lot of the positive feedback has actually come from the younger members of the audience. These people are primed on computer games and first-person shooters, so it's a much more natural fit for them. But when we start to talk about high frame rate in the dome, it doesn't hold the same expectation of that 24 frames a second aesthetic that people enjoy about cinema. And so, having this extra frame rate is a great asset to us because we've got such a large surface area to deal with. And it really helps with that sense of presence and that ability to transport someone to another environment. So I think high frame rate has a natural home in Fulldome, and people have kind of started with 48, 60s, pretty common these days. I'm not aware of anyone doing 120 yet, but that's another logical progression, which God knows how many years that's going to add to the pipeline. Slide. I'm just going to jump on that one. Okay, so kind of IT infrastructure implications. Okay, these slides have got a bit mangled. There's too much text on there anyway, so I'll just proceed. So the average kind of 4K 2D dome show, talking maybe 7 terabytes of storage over the life of that show. This obviously kind of scales crazily. I haven't actually done the maths on that, but it gets quite high as we deal with these other specifications. But so when we're not talking about resolution, but we're talking about data rates. The data rate of kind of HD 1920 1080 footage is uncompressed, just under 200 megabytes a second. So just dealing with the baseline of 4K 2D 30 frames a second, we're at 1.5 gigabytes a second. And so when you look at the capabilities of kind of modern hard drives and things like that, so even an SSD, you're lucky if you get 500 megabytes a second read from that. It's dropped off my slide. There's some new technology that's kind of just available now. So the PCIe SSD cards, so they remove the SATA interface, directly kind of hardwired into the motherboard. These things can get about 2400 megabytes a second on one, and you can stripe those together like you would a normal hard drive and kind of scale that up. So that's quite an exciting development for local, super fast local cache storage, to start to think about approaching the editing process in a whole new way. But yeah, the data rate starts to jump up quite crazily, and so you have to consider your kind of workflow, how you're going to structure your team. If you've got a small team, you assign one shot per artist, then you can consider kind of islands of storage, local storage, and make use of some of those technologies. But most of the time, you're dealing with multiple artists working on across different shots, so you need a centralized file store that's accessible over the network. Then you get this whole other pressure point of network. So even if we go to 10 gig, real world, we're still only talking 600 or so megabytes a second. 40 gig is now feasible. Theoretically, that can go up to 5 gigabytes a second, but there's a lot of interplay between your storage, your network, your client workstation. So it's a challenge moving all this data around. Is kind of the basic thing. So actually, this is what that comes out. But this basically right down at the bottom here, we've got HD, the data rate of HD. And then if we jump up to Fulldome 8K, 60 frames a second, we go from a couple of hundred megabytes to 24 gigabytes a second. So there isn't actually, I don't think there's actually a storage thing with that performance to kind of do that. And there wouldn't be a client machine that would be able to do anything with that data. So we've kind of just got to the point where 4K production is feasible and there's ways to do it in quite efficiently, but now we're killing ourselves again and kind of going back to the dark ages. But that's what we do. Okay, sorry. Just kind of briefly, dome testing, absolutely crucial, essential part of the process. The more iterations you can get on the dome, the better your content is going to be, quite simply. The traditional steps. So 3D render, send it out to the farm, get the frames back, do some post-production, comp it, render it out again, another frame sequence. Then you've got to slice it, you've got to encode it, you've got to get that data onto your actual dome system. So it's quite a slow process. There are some kind of new options that are starting to emerge. So we've just architected a direct-to-dome system so we can connect to our centralized file store direct to the dome with no intermediary steps. So this is going to be a big game changer for us to kind of really increase that prototyping window. And in terms of playback as well, there are kind of single server solutions out there that can do 4K 2D 60 frames a second from the frame sequences without having to do any intermediary steps. It'll slice on the fly. So if you're the considerations of specifying a planetarium or a full dome system are kind of different if you're producing as well versus if you're just showing movies to the public. Every dome is different. Great for the dome. Which dome? There's a lack of characterization of the dome. We've been going on about standards forever and on the content side, but it's a real Wild West out there of kind of what you're going to get when you see your film on any dome. So, it'd be great to have more, more characterization, more information on kind of brightness, contrast, color, resolution, and not just kind of, marketing resolution, but resolvable resolution on the dome surface. And I think that's it for me. Thanks. So.
It's definitely still the Wild West out there. So let's talk about distribution briefly, and then we'll get into a little bit more about why it's still the Wild West out there and maybe what we can do about it. Hopefully, most people don't need to worry about distribution. There are a few people in this room that do. There are two main types of theaters out there, or theater systems. There are the types that can take a single encoded dome master file and in real time split it out for the projectors, or it's just a single projector that projects onto the dome. Those tend to be the smaller domes. The larger ones with more resolution will have multiple projectors around the dome, and there's a process that needs to be done to rip the dome master apart into individual channels for each of the projectors. MPEG-2 still dominates as a codec, primarily due to the decode speed. There are a lot of other interesting codecs that are being developed now, but because of the resolutions we deal with, we're mainly concerned about decode speed and not so much about bandwidth or storage size that a lot of the newer codecs are focusing their development on. The slicing tools for conforming dome masters to particular theaters tend to be proprietary to the manufacturers. And the dome master is currently the only universal format. I'm not even sure if it's officially codified yet. We've been working on that for a very long time, but it is a universal format, sort of a de facto standard. And now with things like Oculus Rift coming along, I hear rumblings about, well, maybe it shouldn't be, maybe it should be something else, and maybe that's true, but right now we're looking at Dome Masters. So just to give you an idea of how wild the West is out there, the company I work for, Spitz Incorporated, we distribute not only our films, but other producers as well. In our library, we currently have 430 pieces of content and 101 different theater formats. 101, when I say 101, that's not hyperbole. Literally, I counted. We have 101 different theater specifications that we distribute to. If we were to encode all of those pieces of content for all formats, we'd have 43,430 distribution packages. Thankfully, not all the theaters are buying all the content, or maybe not thankfully. Maybe I wish they would, but our actual count as of when I left was 2,507 different distribution packages for those 430 different pieces of content. Ryan, they're yours, right? I want to turn this over to Ryan Wyatt to talk a little bit more about distribution and color and things like that.
Well, interesting that Paul basically stole my thunder. But the comment I wanted to make actually is, I mean, first of all, in just talking about this production process, you've now seen how much work goes into these productions. And at the end of this chain, you have this distribution challenge of these bajillions of different kinds of formats. If you really want to hear a rant about it, talk to Mark Peterson. But all of that is just to get some pixels up on a dome and hopefully a soundtrack playing in sync with it. And yet, for those of us who create content, who actually want our content to look good and sound good and play correctly on the theater, it's even a little bit more daunting because, and I've made the observation now to sort of several people here at in the past couple of days whose opinion I trust, and no one has laughed at me, so I feel free to make this observation in front of a larger audience. But we've been kind of living in this sort of a brief halcyon period of almost a decade or so, when most of the projection systems that are being used have very similar kind of color and display characteristics. They're not identical by any means, but they're kind of have existed within a certain realm. Sort of LCOS and DLP projectors just have a relatively some. Now you've got the outliers like the Zorro and Velvet projectors, but back when I worked at the American Museum of Natural History in the early aughts, we were taking our content and looking at it on things like, for those of you who remember it, the AdLip, the laser projector that was created by Zeiss, and projection systems that have radically different color characteristics. So the image I have up here is a CIE color chart, and the triangle, we're only showing one triangle here, but that represents, if you got an R, G, and B, you can think of those as the three vertices of that triangle, and they only capture a small percentage of the colors that you can perceive, where the entire sort of region that's colored in represents kind of the whole full range of colors. Now, a laser projection system will have a larger triangle, mostly extending up toward the top of that kind of arc. And this is just color. There's also brightness and contrast characteristics to think about. But all of our projection triangles look kind of the same. And now as we move to this wider range of projection technologies and newer laser light source projection technologies, LED projectors, these have very different color characteristics, very different display characteristics. And now I think we're going to be finding more surprises for those of us who produce content, looking at it in different theaters, if we don't find ways to more cleverly process the imagery before it gets displayed in another theater. So Paul has already really kind of talked about this, but so if you do a color grading, what theater do you do it for? We can this is just a scene from our current show, Habitat Earth, where we're swimming out upstream with some salmon, and we can apply a gamma correction to make it darker, to make it brighter, but the But unless you know the characteristics of the theater to which you are sending the images, you can't even really do that intelligently. In our production process at the Academy of Sciences, we actually have a color lookup table that allows us to preview content in monitors downstairs in the reduced and often disappointing color space of the Dome Theater. And that was arrived at empirically by basically doing kind of wedge tests in the Dome. But we really are, as a community, going to have to figure out how to optimize content as we move it from this long and challenging production process into the distribution side. And then I'm only going to put up one slide about audio just because it's too painful to think about it in any greater detail. But if the imagery is challenging, the audio is even more so. And once again, if you want to achieve more of an optimal translation of the content that's created often for very specific theater, but that's created to be experienced in a certain way, I really hope that we can move beyond what I have started to think of as sort of the lowest common denominator audio. I mean, if you're creating a show with a narrator, you probably want the narrator to be understood. And since the characteristics of audio systems in various planetariums range from the spectacular to the disappointing, you tend to mix so that, well, whatever you do, make sure that the narrator can be heard in this 5:1 mix or whatever. And you end up with some very disappointing mixes, particularly if you see something in a theater like San Francisco or New York, and then hear it in another theater. It never quite sounds quite the same. So it would be nice to really consider that as we also look at distribution mechanisms. So luckily, AFDI, the working group that is starting to look at these technology issues, I hope we'll be addressing a lot of these concerns. But I just wanted to kind of make those observations in terms of distribution to recognize the incredible effort that goes into this production pipeline and hope that it can be realized on multiple domes more optimally in the future.
Thanks, guys. That was great. Okay, and we have 20 minutes to cover the next two parts of our mini-series, and then questions to follow that. So I don't know how these guys are going to do it, but guys, here we go, part 4. And come on down.
We just do by talking really fast. No. I've been working on that. That's not a good trend. I will make my intro very brief, and because of that brevity, I will leave, unfortunately, a lot of gaps in this thing covering software and options. The effective point that I wanted to make is we made a discovery a decade ago, a bit more than that, when we're fortunate to have, let's see if I find my picture, I'm going to jump, see if my photo's in there. Nope, I'm in Kachin's part, so my part's not even in there. Then it's really going to be short, which is just fine. Okay, the merging of PowerPoints is a new adventure, so all of this exists in the cloud. We hope it made it up and didn't quite get there. The brief section that I had to do with some experiences in Denver, where we were fortunate to have a grant to put in over a $5 million supercomputer system and a subsystem to fire 11 channels and create the first 4K digital dome, open 2002, 2003. In the production process, we developed on-site our first interactive, calls it Cosmic Atlas version, which is basically spheres in black space moving around and texture mapping on the spheres. The thing worked marvelously, 60 frames per second, really high color depth. It was beautiful. And we had some smart folks on board that allowed us to capture the frames as we flew. And I said, instant movie, 4K, we'd done it. We're great. And we did. We saved some frames out from that, created a show we call it CJ, our solar system show. And it's gone through 5 iterations now. But the thing that was so cool about that was it was flown in real time. It introduced a completely different feeling of floating and flying, and that was why we got the money to do this, was to be in space, like you're really there. There's this subtlety that was interjected of having a pilot there, that you're cruising ahead, but you're not linearly going ahead. It's not a calculated pathway. It's like you're really floating and approaching. And it was palpable. It's actually been the mainstay for this show all along. So the point is that the tech does exist to capture real-time frames. It introduces a completely different opportunity for choreography and for style. And it's a highly efficient method because you're done. You fly the good path and you're done. Yeah, right. You fly the good path, and then you have to go back and make it a show. The post, the audio, the transitions, and the rest is quite complex. With that said, there's two presentations that we'll be looking at this event that have some of that real-time component to it. Both of those, these gentlemen were quite involved with, but this is the Bella Gaia program running Friday night, which is the more recent pass of using those techniques of real-time choreography and some post work on a really, really streamlined budget and a timeline method, and much of that worked. I did want to rattle off the list of packages for real time. I'm going to leave that to what you all pick up here for the rest of this event. At the Pro Show, many of the real-time providers will be there. We're also having a Blender workshop. There's quite a few different pathways to accomplish. Blender's not real-time. What am I saying? We'll back up. The real-time folks talked to Friday, and there's also a handful of free programs that are out there also. But with that, I want to introduce my two counterparts here. Dr. Kachun Yu, who I have worked with for a decade at the museum, facilitated and allowed much of this to happen. He's a bit more concerned about why and what the process is for that, how you choose what you show, and what's cool, the kind of programming that you can move into when you have the real time. And Toshi's with us, who has been lurking in the background for a long time, single-handedly writing and duplicating almost everything we're talking about in Japanese for his audience, for his theater. It's this amazing first, if you look at the research on it, it's like first 4K stereo, first 8K stereo, first interactive, drag it on the screen, first. That's the guy. Kachun, let's go ahead and dive in.
All right, thanks, Dan. Because we are short on time, I'm going to be going pretty quick, and I want to point out that there is a real-time panel that is happening later this afternoon, so I encourage you to see that, and I'll also be talking about some evaluation and education results very briefly here, but there is also an education panel Saturday morning. But first of all, what do we mean by real-time? And there actually is a computer graphics definition of real-time in the sense that you're dealing with interactive computer graphics, like in a video game, or if you're running a planetarium simulation software live in the dome, where the user or the viewer reacts to what is happening on the screen. And in traditional computer graphics, it's a 2D image on the screen, but it gets more complicated in Fulldome. And this feedback affects what the software does, and so and affects what is generated, and then you change the scene, and then this happens over and over for every frame, and for this interaction to appear live, meaning so-called real time, you need at least a frame rate of at least 15 frames per second. And Paul mentioned earlier that potentially maybe they'd be going to rendering 120 frames per second, God forbid, in sometime in the distant or near future. But it turns out that according to a lot of perception studies, the maximum frame rate is probably more like 72. So any more than that, you're really adding information that's not necessary. And if you look at an actual graphics pipeline, so what's actually happening in the computer, or more today, more like what's happening in the graphics card, you have three different stages or steps. You have an application stage, a geometry stage, and a rasterizing stage. So first of all, the application actually decides what sort of geometry primitives have to be sent to the next stage. So these could be points, there could be lines, there could be triangles, and of course, in computer graphics, most things tend to be built up from triangles. And then in the geometry stage, it gets a lot more complicated, where you actually figure out what should be drawn, how it should be drawn, what sort of shading goes on, and where it should be drawn on the screen. And then finally, actually drawing it and determining what sort of colors you want to assign. And there's also different types of shading that can go on. And then what's really critical here is that you have to do these steps for every single frame. So if you're running 30 frames per second, this is happening inside your computer, inside the GPU, 30 times a second, or even more so. So this is where doing real-time coding can become very tricky because you're trying to optimize these steps so that it can happen at an appreciable frame rate. All right, and I'm not going to go into this, but the fact that these stages can get much more complicated. There can be things that can happen step by step or in parallel. And in just the last couple minutes, I'm just going to go briefly over just the types of programs that can be done, and we'll be talking more about it in the real-time panel later this afternoon. But since Fulldome sort of arose from digital planetariums, there is historically a huge amount of astronomy content. But in recent years, we've also started seeing content migrate towards the Earth, so that you're doing educational programs about geology, geography, but also getting into biology. Anything that you can put in as a map on the surface of the Earth, you can show. Physical processes on the Earth systems. And what's really interesting is that through these programs, you can deal with topics that really impact the audiences at that local level. So here at Denver, we've done presentations on drought, on wildfires, and even flying down into panoramic vistas of regions that have been ravaged by fire, going underground into subsurface geological models, and then moving into pure biology. So we will have a neurodome demonstration one of these evenings. So that's clearly one other direction that we'll be moving towards. Now, as far as what the benefits and trade-offs of real-time versus a pre-rendered movie, obviously you can get much better engagement with an audience, where the presenter can tailor his or her presentation with the audience, and potentially you can also have lower costs since you don't have all the animation and rendering budgets, but you're also limited to what is existing in the real-time software. And then finally, the audience expectations might be different, so that people who come in and are expecting to see a movie will have different learning, different motivation, different affective expectations than when they're coming to hear a speaker. And that might also explain a lot of the sort of the educational or outcomes that people see in the research when they compare real-time versus pre-rendered films. And I'm not going to be able to go into detail into the studies, and I'm happy to talk to people afterwards. But overall, there does seem to be benefits of real-time presentations over the same presentation done with a sort of a pre-recorded content. And these studies go back decades, predating Fulldome, and they are very interesting, and it's something to consider as you are thinking about what sort of programs you want to do. So that, I want to turn it over to Toshiyuki Takahei, who, as Dan mentioned in his introduction, has done a lot of really pioneering work as far as real-time tools.
This is yours, right? Oh, here's my slide. Hi, I'm Toshi, and in Japan we have lots of, more than hundreds of domes. So these days, more and more people want to know what is a Fulldome environment. So I like to invite such talented people to Fulldome community. I want to teach them what is a Fulldome. But I feel the problem that it's difficult to understand the special characteristics of dome environment, and you have to use a special toolkit. So my language is making a software. So I wrote Fulldome playback software to make them understand the Fulldome environment. This is my software, and it's freely available, so please try by yourself. It's named Amateurs. And using this, at first, I make them understand the Fulldome environment, how the shape is distorted by the showing the merge angle viewing or simulate the merge projection environment, for example. And also these days, I think the best way to previewing the DOM content is using the VR head-mount display devices such as Oculus Rift. So these days, more and more my friend producers are using this device for previewing the DOM content. And also, this software has a capability of simulating the flat contents distortion in many ways. So, for example, as you know, the big flat image on the curved DOM screen, as a smart way is a kind of simulation of projected image on the DOM surface. So people can understand how the flat content is distorted on the DOM screen by using the test projection or Oculus Rift or such kind of things. And also testing with familiar content is very useful to understand. So using the desktop streaming technique, people can test, for example, a flat YouTube movie content on the DOM surface, or flat, but even the 3D Google Earth content on DOM surface, for example, to understand how the 3D shapes are distorted on the DOM screen surface. And sometimes showing the real-time color correction example using the shader techniques to understand how the image become dim on the DOM surface. And also, these days, more and more panorama or 360 cameras are available. So I provide a real-time conversion way to use such panoramic image and movies to Fulldome environment. And also, for example, this is, I made a kind of PowerPoint template to write a simple way to write curved text on the DOM master. And using the desktop capture technique, people can understand in real-time editing or using PowerPoint for kind of Fulldome representation in actual DOM environment. And also using the desktop capture, my friends are using the After Effects or Final Cut DOM master rendering in real time to the head-mount display to know intermediate rendering process. This is maybe a smart way to workflow for the DOM production. And also kind of real-time things. We have many pop culture in Japan, kind of Among Us and animations, and there are many huge community of characters, songs, motions of such animation characters, and also free tools. So sometimes I write a plugin from such free software, 3D real-time graphics software to DOM master output to make a bridge to the our DOM master community. And also Unity or Unreal Engine is a great tool to work, play with, and maybe this kind of way will replace some part of DOM production because it's a kind of resolution and frame rate independent way. Yep, these are my recent works. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Toshi and Kachun. I'm going to very briefly jump back because my slides were in there, and obviously we just had the wrong order, which is a couple of points that I wanted to make. Alrighty. Briefly, the history behind the VR, much of it tracks back into the early 90s, where folks were, again, using the big supercomputers to create real early VR, and one of the breakthroughs there was the Cave, which is the six-sided environment This was the precursor to much of what we're using. A lot of this is adapted by industry and by military for simulation. That has followed a parallel course to our work. In many ways, I want to see if IMERSA can help merge some of the capabilities from that art. Let's see, simulation things, a few shots from Denver, that wall of computers that I had to retire a while back. That was a very expensive pile of iron that went out the door. A few of the softwares, here is that list. The Digistar from ENS that we'll see in a little bit, UniView from SKIS, another one from Digitalis that is technically a free version. Worldwide Telescope is technically a free version. Digital Sky, Sky Explorer, RSA Cosmos, and I didn't type in the full name of your wonderful software that you can talk about more. The other one, too, is this delightful overlap for interface, for the haptic, for people interacting with the real time of the gaming tools. So think about the future a little bit. We have a whole lot of kids that are quite adept at flying these variety of different tools, and they directly adapt to our real-time environment. The change in workflow to be able to quickly preview a scene in context in the dome to communicate to the rest of the producers what you want. And that's another one that I'm excited that we're seeing a lot of trend of using the 3D goggles and glasses and Oculus for previs. This one is an entire afternoon of discussions that we want to kind of kick off here, and then we'll be doing demonstrations and looking at things throughout this event. Post work isn't simple. You save those frames, but they're not necessarily ready to go, so there's a lot to do that. And that was the brief part of my slide. So I think it's a wrap. Nope. Or we have one more group. Go, go, go.
There's always more. Like I said, we could talk for 8 hours on this stuff. We're not going to, but we have part 5, and we're going to go straight till noon, if that's okay with you guys. Are you guys okay to go till noon? Okay, good. There's a little bit of enthusiasm. Wake up. There's more. Okay, come on up, guys.
So, hello. Okay, is everybody awake, I hope? Because what I would like to start with is with a kind of a provocative statement that I think that our environment that we love so much, our Fulldome theater, will change, pretty massive in like 20 or 50 years' time, technological-wise, and, 3 different other aspects. But what will stay are the concepts that were elaborated for many years, or that we elaborated to expand on the mind concept of our audiences. That's what I believe. And that's why I would like to make a little bit of a reflection to the past and to the history of planetariums and immersion and the old concepts. Okay, so what we had was, for example, one of the first planetarium, which was actually not called a planetarium. It was the Gottorfer Globus. So here again, the Germans. It was produced or realized for a German Duke, Friedrich III, in the 17th century. And what was quite amazing with this tool was the Earth's surface was mapped on the outside. So that's why the name Globus. But on the inside, 12 people could be accommodated. And it gave like the first impression of the starry sky and star constellations. And through water power, the whole axis could rotate. So the people inside could experience the star rotation, which I thought it was quite insane for the 17th century. Okay, and then we had the whole phenomena of dioramas. I don't know how far you heard about them, but if you think about it, I mean, they built huge spheres, 30 meter in diameter, only to map the Earth's surface or the cartography on the inside walls. And the concept behind that was to embrace the audiences in one glance with the whole surface of the Earth. So only for that reason we would build these huge spheres, globes. And the interesting thing is, those things never survived long. like, so the world fairs were huge attractions. Lots of audiences would came and they would be wowed. But after a few years, and the audience came through that experience, they lost their audiences and they have to break it down. Nevertheless, those people were so struck by the concept, so they would rebuild it. And so also in London, there was the Great Globe that was rebuilt. And James Wilde, he tried so hard, so he would do even live guided tours, to have that concept of travel, because they believed that travel was good for the human mind. And still, they would have to put it down because there were other attractions that became more interesting. The only one that survived is actually the Maparium, and it's based in Massachusetts, in Boston, the Boston Library. Okay, and then we had the start with the Wonder of Vienna, right? So there was Bauersfield and there were the Zeiss guys, and they thought they need to build a dome. Why would they think they need to build a big dome? Okay, I mean, they had a client in Munich, okay. But even the client, like, why would they need that? Why would they like to put, that arrays and all the little models and, put them on the ceiling? And one goal of Bauersfield was that he wanted to build a learning environment, and he wanted to have the appreciation of the night starry sky without light pollution, of the 9,200 stars that can be seen from Earth. And he wanted to make the multifarusment or multifacets of the natural phenomena available to human perception. So, and here art and science comes in. And also, so what they wanted as well to show celestial body movements, for example, and not have to wait for hundreds of years for astronomical phenomena to happen. Then we had the movies, there was the whole era, right, of going to the moon and going farther with the concept from the micro to the macro, etc. Also for the New York World's Fair. And the whole concept behind that was to free the viewer of conventional ideas of time and scale, put million years into 1 second, and to do the tours from the micro to the macro. Then, eventually, actually, it's not, well, there are some images missing, I'm sorry for that. And then there were two other concepts that I found very important to mention. One is the Vanderdyck, from Vanderdyck. He was an artist, and he developed the movie drone. And with the movie drone, he believed in the direct transmission of emotion. And he believed in a network of movie drones, that will be mapped out all over the Earth, will be connected, and will have a library of real-time data and usage, which we kind of have today, right? And then this other artist from the EAT, Electronic Arts Society, were artists and engineers that developed the living responsive environment in 1970. That was already a mirror projection on a dome, and it had responding sound on the ground. So if we look now and reflect a little bit, so they put so much effort, right, in the times to do some earth science, like what they knew in that time, and what we are capable today, right? So it changed quite dramatically. And what I would like to to remind you as well is how much the creation process changed. So first we were thinking from the inside to the outside. So we were thinking how to project the stars onto the dome ceiling, right? And the next really big mind-blowing thing was the digital dome era, right? Because then we were taking that process from the inside to the outside. And now we are thinking of 3D environments, 3D worlds that we can create, and we would move our audiences through them. And that's also something that helped that threshold to become true. So, there was the world model in the Bronze Age. It's very, very old. And of course, our audiences would know, they would read in books, etc., about the universe, distances, and so. But their daily experiences, when they look into the starry sky, right, that they don't really see the depth of the different stars. So it's then when in the digital planetarium, we take them from that Earth perspective and break through that they realize, they're actually in different distances. And the star constellations, as I see them from Earth, they are direct apart. Okay? So the knowledge that they had changed to experienced knowledge. So now they knew by heart, because they experienced, because they have been to that, journey, travel, they experienced how those, for example, constellations are direct apart. Okay, so what was the next step? The next step, or the next, mind-blowing thing, how I would like to call it, was the Digital Universe Atlas. So it was a building of, a 3D model of the known universe, which allowed, or allows now, to do so many stuff with it. So to do zooms, passages through it. And if we look back now to the concepts that were already there in the 70s, from the micro to the macro, there is still a lot to cover, because when we think of each level of a world model and how they have their own rules, how we will do the transitions, etc. And so I would like to, you to think, what will be like the next thing, content-wise? Will it be that we need different perspectives? So not the geocentric one, not from the, from Earth's sphere, but from other locations in the universe that will change our whole model? Will it be to see the universe, this 3D digital universe model, through different channels, wavelengths like, X-ray, radio, infrared? Will it be that we need a dynamic digital universe atlas, and maybe then also a dynamic digital Earth atlas, ocean atlas, etc.? So that would be, I think, things that we need to think of, especially now if we are, all together, the software makers, the producers. What will be like the next mind-expanding thing that we could create, possibly? Okay, and here's where I would like also to give a little bit of a frightening friction, because there's so much stuff going on technology-wise through VR, etc. And I don't know if you realize, but sometimes I get some goosebumps thinking like, gosh, maybe we get overtaken. Maybe they don't, they wouldn't need us anymore. Maybe they would do all this stuff in VRs and they private immersion living rooms, etc. So let's have a look to that. And I think Aaron will save us now, because he will now tell us the secrets about the new technology that is around.
Yay. Thank you, Isabella. Yeah, I too get goosebumps, but maybe in a good way, not a scared way. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the broader picture of Fulldome, what's going on right now, and what we might see in the future as well. Okay, so the most prevalent content in Fulldome right now is Earth and space educational shows. This makes up a huge percentage of the market and is probably going to be sticking around for some time. But if we look at the wider field of Fulldome right now, we can see a cross-section of the future of the medium in its infancy. So a quick overview of these. We have VJing and similar AV performances. These deal with abstract forms. We're seeing domes being transformed into social spaces where imagery isn't necessarily the focus. Research spaces using immersion to better understand data. So theatrical art. So art-driven pieces, including theatrical performances, usually having audience participation as well. Entertainment domes create a thrill experience that's often used to promote companies and products. Gaming in the dome. So this is still relatively crude experience. but new forms of multiplayer immersion gameplay are beginning to emerge. Because there's little data regarding these smaller subsets of Fulldome, projecting meaningful predictions on how they're going to develop is impossible. But as these subsets continue to develop, we'll probably see more purpose-built domes to cater for them. Places like the Society of Arts and Technology to the top left, which is in Montreal, and Dance Dome in Wales. These are carving models for other future developments. Others may be attached to academic institutions, cinemas, or gallery spaces. And we could eventually see a number of domes appearing in the same city with completely different uses. So what's beyond the dome? If we look at some of the sci-fi concepts of immersion, we can build a picture of the futurist notions of immersive technologies through of immersive media. And surely all we really want is a holodeck. But until we have our holodeck, there are a number of other forms of immersion, each with their own unique differences. Looking at a couple of those, we've got projection mapping. So this is an extension of the dome into the living room. So as TVs get bigger and curved screens, the next logical step is to expand beyond the frame. Augmented reality has been around in various forms for a while. It scans its surroundings and allows the user to interact with the virtual elements within their environment. It's experiencing a resurgence at the moment with developments of products such as the HoloLens and Google Glass. HMDs, he's getting those goosegumples right there. Commercial HMDs have been around since the 90s. But the gap between technology and experience has been too great for it to flourish. But now the technology has improved and the experience has reached new levels, which has caused a swell in the development of many devices. The most recent buzz has been amplified by the acquisition of Oculus Rift by social media giants Facebook for $2 billion. It's pretty safe to assume that HMDs will have a place in the future of immersion. So if we have a look at what's going on in VR right now, interactivity seems to be key for most VR projects. I don't know if anyone's played with this, but if you use Oculus Rift in conjunction with other products such as Leap Motion, it's possible to create to have interaction through gestures. So here we're seeing avatar versions of our own hands, and we can interact with the stars, hold our hand up, grab a constellation out of the sky, pull it towards us, and see the three-dimensional structure of those constellations. Potentially, this could be a more cost-effective method of teaching astronomy over a multi-million-dollar dome installation. Okay, the unveiling of Oculus Story a few weeks ago highlights how serious Oculus are about expanding the market beyond gaming and investing into new forms of storytelling. With Pixar directors and top animators attached to the project, we'll soon see creative leaps in how we tell immersive stories. And for those who think VR is a more of a solitary environment, it doesn't necessarily have to be. So there are some examples of multi-user online virtual environments where people sat at home can socialize and interact and explore VR environments together, similar to something like Second Life. So here we see a bunch of people. This is Yanis, and you can chat to them and walk around a virtual world and hang out in a bar, etc. So group VR spaces, this is another step closer to that holodeck that we would like to have. So let's discuss. You can already see some of these areas converging, but how would they evolve? There's multiple directions that the future of immersive media can take, and a couple of questions to throw out there is, how does Fulldome experience differ from VR? Is Fulldome as immersive as VR? Are HMDs too intrusive? You know, a lot of people hate going to watch 3D films because of the glasses. Are we going to see this thing fall on its face because people just don't like sticking stuff on their face? Is interaction required for the ultimate immersive experience? And is VR to Fulldome what TV is to cinema? So will we see, you know, what people are doing in VR now? Will they be going to a dome to go and experience these VR experiences they're having on their own with a group of people? So these are just a few of the questions that we hope to discuss over the next few days, and probably hand back to Michael now to maybe open that discussion.